One day, in the early 1980s, Soviet screenwriter Viktor Mireshko saw a sign on the pole, "Lonely Woman Seeks Lifetime Companion." Back then, nothing like this was even published in newspapers, and no one even dreamed of dating website, so such self-promotion seemed unthinkable. When Mireshko told his wife about this, she didn't believe him. To prove his case, the screenwriter rushed outside to find evidence, but the sign had already disappeared. This unconventional move, especially for a woman of the time, inspired him to write a screenplay about the fate of lonely people in a month, which was then adapted to a film of the same name. The protagonist of The Lonely Woman Seeks Lifetime Companion is a 43-year-old woman named Claudia, who wrote 5 ads saying a lonely woman wants to meet a responsible man. The same evening, a man calling himself Valentine answers the ad. He's tipsy, but the woman lets him into the apartment. It turns out that Valentine is divorced, struggling, a heavy drinker, a former circus performer on disability, and homeless. Throughout this movie, Claudia and Valentine, who are both lonely and unhappy people, would get a bit closer, though not without a struggle. Claudia is a very closed-off, tough, yet extremely determined woman, and although the film is not a happy love story, by the end, she becomes softer and more open, freer. Many describe the film as the story of a woman who built an illusion of a prince, only for that illusion to be shattered against the reality of the man who responded to her ad. But I don't think that's what the story is about. Throughout the film, Claudia is actually fending off the gossip and judgment of her friends, all of whom urge her to find someone more respectable, wealthier, and so on. She sees that beneath the guise of concern, the women around her are hiding a simple desire to get under her skin and humiliate. To me, the core of the story lies in Claudia's very gesture of doing ads, a desperate yet sincere one. She's lonely, but she wants to take her life into her own hands and find a life partner. An act that, at the end of the movie, inspires her neighbor, another lonely woman, to write the ad too, to get out of the cocoon despite what other people might think. The act of writing the ad that she wishes to find a man for a woman in the 1980s in the USSR was essentially an Übermenschen Nietzschean act. The message is not that you should go and save an alcoholic, but that those who don't risk are not going to make it. You have to put yourself out there if you want anything in return. Those who don't fight don't survive. Earlier this February, a Twitter user, Murray Hill Guy, ran an experiment by creating a fake Hinge account using pictures of a real girl, which got more than 1,000 likes so fast that he proclaimed that online dating is indeed over. And being a man on a dating app is basically a humiliation ritual. It is almost impossible to go through all the options as a woman, and whether a girl even sees your profile, even if you are a Chad and a 10 out of 10 man, largely depends on sheer luck and good timing. And if you got a premium super like just to have a better position in a line. The result aren't something that we didn't know. Guys made fake women's accounts before, and it's common knowledge these days that women on average get more likes and attention on dating apps. But when women respond that the attention they get is superficial and low quality, it sounds to men like first world problems, and that the only reason women use these apps is to seek validation. But let's be honest for a second. If things were so awesome for women, then I would like to ask, who wrote 4 million reports, who filmed 4 million videos complaining about guys ghosting them, all these end-of-the-year dating wrapped and unwrapped spreadsheets with dates on Bumble, and my experience with a Tinder manipulator and narcissist story times. I don't see any reason to envy women's experience on the apps, except if you just want more options for sex. Because if one is really concerned with finding their one and only second half, then technically you only need one good match. You only need one person. Or what? You want to see the whole catalog? Because if anything, the disproportionately huge amount of options for women and still the lack of successful relationship showcases that it doesn't matter, you're still lonely. I remember there was a bit of a backlash after one girl posted that she hosted a Hinge night with her friends to go through her more than 1,000 Hinge matches, and men were up in arms in the comment section that the girl had so many options. And I don't know whether she found her significant other after this, or maybe this was all just for the content, maybe for validation or whatever. And yet something tells me that if one really had an option, they would rather go on a date with a significant other rather than have a bingo night with friends ridiculing dating app profiles. It is a person on an app. It is a lonely person, no matter how cool and above it all they try to seem. If you really think that women are not hurt by dating apps, completely delusional. 1,000 Hinge likes, but you only need one person. There is this Substack article by McGowan about how she recently developed an app that would simulate hot women's experience on dating apps and called it a girl hinge, so that the guys could see for themselves what it is like. This app allowed men to simulate the experience of validation, but also to experience who is giving this validation and how. And in this article, she shares how she was surprised that her AI-generated messages and profiles were indistinguishable to observers from real profiles, but also how all real profiles are indistinguishable from one another, as if there is a silent consensus among men. Quote, "What struck me most about the response to Girl Hinge was not that people couldn't tell it was fake, but that the distinction barely registered as relevant. The messages felt real enough, familiar enough." This sameness is predicated not on men copying each other, but rather on them reacting to the same pressure points and feedback loops. She writes that there was some backlash online about her posting screenshots of messages and mocking them, since people didn't realize that they were talking to a chatbot and not a real person. For her, it was also revealing that even making fun of those AI-generated profiles for sounding cheeky or cringe or desperate felt a bit off because they are indistinguishable from the real ones. The inherent vulnerability of being on apps was still observable, even in the simulation. Film Lonely Woman's Sixth Companion and Hinge Experiments perfectly highlight the inherent vulnerability of openly seeking companionship. It is supposed to happen naturally. It shouldn't be that difficult. And you're supposed to be nonchalant about it. Right? 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 Right?
Let me tell you what a dinner with me and a woman looks like. Woman sits next to me, looks hot, the other man at the table respect that, and we talk about business, and I genuinely ignore her the whole time.
A German 19th century philosopher, Arthur Schopenhauer, is the OG Manosphere guy, and from what I remember, way back when incel.com was still up, he was one of the key featured figures, largely thanks to his misogynistic essay on women, which we all love and cherish. I want to preface this section by saying that this is not some kind of attempt to dunk on Schopenhauer. We love him on this channel. Finally, a Carolina that actually loves this man. He is one of the greatest thinkers of all time, and I find a lot of solace in his pessimistic philosophy. But he was also a very difficult person whose romantic life left much to be desired. And it can't be said that this didn't bother him, unlike his idol, another German philosopher, Immanuel Kant, who embodied an ascetic ideal. And yet, precisely because of these contradicting and sincere attempts to grapple with the metaphysics of love and gender dynamics that are definitely influenced by his personal frustrations, he is, in my opinion, a fitting figure for this day and age. As I was saying in one of my previous videos, bitterness and vengeful impulses unfortunately are at play in the realm of modern love. But as we will see with Schopenhauer, it was as relevant many years ago. It is important to recognize Schopenhauer within before it's too late. Now, before reading Schopenhauer's biography, I was aware of this meme that his essay on women was the result of him being rejected by someone he liked. But I didn't know the details, and oh boy. Talking about dating as a humiliation ritual. Schopenhauer in general had difficult relationships with people, but women especially spiked his cortisol levels. Interestingly, he had two Carolinas that tortured him. The first one was a young dancer, Carolina Medon, with whom he had somewhat of a love affair that lasted for a decade. According to Schopenhauer, Medon was the object of his amour, but it was rooted solely in sexual impulse. Medon was quite cold towards him, though, and during their affair had a kid from another man. Still, the philosopher never forgot her, and she was included in his will. The second Carolina was Schopenhauer's neighbor, the 47-year-old seamstress whom he may or may not pushed down the stairs during a conflict, and who then, by a court decision, the philosopher had to financially support for 20 years. He also had some other unsuccessful romantic attempts, for instance with Flora Weiss, the attempt that his biographer describes as quite pathetic. Weiss was much younger than Schopenhauer and felt an aversion towards him. In his early life, when he was still grappling with his frustrating affair with Medon, Schopenhauer had a very interesting concept called tetragamy that he considered as a superior alternative to monogamy. Monogamy is an unnatural relationship because it doesn't take into consideration people's sex drives. And here is an interesting point. Since young women have a high sex drive that one man can't sustain, and that's why, according to Schopenhauer, young women always cheat, but also an older man easily loses sexual interest to his aging wife, while still having some reproductive capacities. To solve this problem, he proposes tetragamy, where, quote, two young men should marry a young woman, and when she outgrew her reproductive ability and thereby lost her attractiveness to her husbands, the two men should marry another young woman who would, quote, last until the two young men were old. I like how even in this imaginary marital union he is still cocked. Schopenhauer thought that this type of union is very practical since it is easier for two young men to financially support a woman than for each of them to start their own family unit, and when they are older and more financially stable, they can provide for a second wife too and their wagon of children. You might be thinking, well, what about kids? How will we know who the father is of which child, since there were no DNA paternity tests at the time? Well, apparently, it doesn't matter for a mother, since women don't care about who the father is, they just want to give birth to babies. And fathers will learn about whose child is whose child when they grow a bit older, and they can tell by observing some similar features. I have a suspicion that these musings on tetragamy were largely influenced by his own experience of cuckoldry and overall romantic disillusionment, but I can't prove it. This concept never made it to being published. Unlike his later work, Metaphysics of Love, in which Schopenhauer elaborates on this idea of the sex drive being the strongest expression of the will to live. Those who are familiar with his magnum opus, The World as Will and Representation, remember his pessimistic descriptions of our existence as a blind, irrational will to live that creates eternal suffering. Love is nothing more than a trick that the will to live plays with us so that we would procreate. Quote, every kind of love, however ethereal it may seem to be, springs entirely from the instinct of sex. To answer the question of why someone is seeing a random autistic guy the way God sees him, it's because nature wants you to have babies with him. And this is the source of our discontent with love. We think that when we pursue someone we love, it is an act of individual choice, but in reality, we act upon what our nature prescribes us to do. So we feel enamored with people who might not suit us as individuals in terms of their temperament or personality, and yet the love somehow flourishes. It is rare for two people who are exactly fitted for each other to meet. Also, our preferences and desires stem from something that we lack, as in this way nature tries to compensate for our disadvantage or give our advantages to others. Quote, "This is why little men prefer big women, and fair people like dark," and so on. Since the opposites attract, people of extremely different temperament frequently marry for love. Quote, "He is coarse, strong, and narrow-minded, while she is very sensitive, refined, cultured, and aesthetic." Or, "He is genial and clever, and she is a goose." So we strive for each other against all odds, sacrificing our happiness in life, going against our individual interests. He also mentions here, of course, the differences between the sexes by saying that a man's love is by nature inconstant, while a woman's is constant. Once he possesses a woman, he longs for change, while it's the other way around for women. Quote, "This is why a man is always desiring other women, while a woman always clings to one man." I find it interesting that here Schopenhauer, an uber-misogynist, repeats another famous philosopher and feminist, Simone de Beauvoir. Though if for Schopenhauer it is part of women's nature to cling to a man, de Beauvoir sees the source in cultural aspects, as women are conditioned to see marriage as an end goal, as it was a question of the survival for centuries for women. While for men, well, because they have other things to do, grind never stops, a marriage is a background to their life, not the culmination of it. Interestingly, Schopenhauer sees the tragedy not only in the unrequited love, for requited love more frequently leads to unhappiness than to happiness. Once the will to live is satisfied, after people unite, the romantic hangover starts. Before one completely blackpills and feels hopeless, Schopenhauer admits that passionate love is sometimes associated with harmony and a complete match of souls, but this can only exist if the instinct of sex has been removed, so basically platonic love. Truly passionate love exists, but it requires two individuals to neutralize each other. The key is to meet a person who can complement the one-sidedness of another, but in a very particular and precise way. But since it's a rare occasion, the only way to have a happy marriage is to completely avoid passion and seek a like-minded partner or an arrangement with some mutual benefits. Schopenhauer was a 19th century thinker who lived a long time ago, and things have changed. Women have more rights, and now we have little portable devices that project rage bait straight onto our retinas, and if I want a compatible boyfriend, I can ask AI to generate him. You can generate a whole family. I like how ChatGPT hallucinated and made our kids Blasian. Honey, we don't need a DNA test. Those kids are yours. Who do you believe, me or your shameless eyes? We live in the 21st century, but it is safe to say that people, regardless of their sexual orientation, by the way, choose someone who produces nothing but pain, rather than a compatible romantic partner. We still date irrationally. Schopenhauer suggested that by discovering one's own character and learning about gender dynamics, one can basically up their game. In his later essay, Aphorisms on the Wisdom of Life, he makes a case for the art of living as successfully and pleasantly as possible. A lot of Schopenhauer's talking points these days are repeated by the online manosphere, red pillars, and incels, though now they would also refer to evolutionary psychology to back their claims. A lot of members of these communities, not all, but a lot of them, largely blame feminism and women's nature for the absolute mess that the current dating scene is. Manosphere communities organize in a kind of boy clubs to impress not so much women as other men. People online usually make jokes about these men-only retreats that Andrew Tate and the likes are organizing, claiming that the manosphere basically consists of closeted gay men. And I don't like it. I think that men like Tate, those podcast guys, and looksmaxers like Clavicular, in my humble opinion, just represent a certain type of straight guy who has psychosexual mess in their heads, and this mess is usually a response to some past unfortunate experiences. For instance, one of the biggest Russian manosphere guys, Arsène Markaryan, yes, we do have Andrew Tate at home, who also due to his misogynistic views and resemblance to a character from The Lord of Rings was nicknamed Miso Gimli. In interviews, admits that his whole career as an influencer, as well as his attitude towards women, was largely sparked by a heartbreak he experienced at 17 or so. He learned everything about women's nature from that. He still remembers the message that the girl who broke his heart wrote to him, word by word, that he's poor and doesn't dress well, and it motivated him to become successful and also to never trust what a woman says she wants in a man. Apparently, that girl who rejected him after he got some success and money still preferred another man who was the opposite of what she initially asked from him. Broke, alcoholic, treated her badly, so the classic bad boy. So now Markarian teaches men how not to succumb to women's manipulations and put them in their right place, how to become a high-value man so that appropriate women would flock around you. Behind all this, there is the idea that you can approach dating strategically, with less pain. You just need the right tactic. Now, Manosphere strategies vary. Some seduction coaches would teach introverted men to cold approach women on the streets, grab them by their butts, and say, "Let's go to the nearest toilets and have sex." What a good way for socially awkward men to learn how to talk to women. I remember people making fun of that tweet a few months ago that advised to approach women in real life with the polite phrase, "May I meet you?" accusing it of being too cheesy and old-fashioned. Well, I would prefer the old-fashioned way anytime. Others would offer various pieces of advice on how to up your game and have sex with lots of women, get lots of sexual experience, and then settle down with a young, beautiful mid-virgin to call your own. Tolstoy wrote about it in the Kreutzer Sonata, a novella I highly recommend reading if you haven't. Spoiler, it ended super well, and they lived long and happily together, and then the whole bus clapped. Some advices are directed towards avoiding so-called тарелочницы, or food diggers, meaning women who use dates to get free meals. The question of who pays for a dinner is a part and parcel of who and what should provide in a relationship. For instance, the Manosphere likes to react to street interviews revealing impossibly high standards of women who all expect their future partners to be 6-foot jacked billionaires. We will put in brackets that these interviews are not data samples that meaningfully inform us about dating realities. What isn't blatantly staged is merely wishful thinking or idle speculation. The question is not what you want, but what you get. But it doesn't stop men from doing commentary on these videos, revealing that only Eastern European women are so materialistic and entitled, that having a pretty face doesn't make one deserving of full financial support while maintaining complete freedom, that women who seek such treatment should also meet a standard themselves of not just attractiveness, but also be educated, well-mannered, and develop a personality. And surely nothing wrong with this advice. I personally also agree with Chekhov that everything should be beautiful in a person: face, clothes, soul, and thoughts. This is why I'm also pro looks maxing, gesture maxing, anything maxing. Upgrading yourself is always a good thing. But the fairy tales, like a man can take the financial responsibility for a woman, but after she already has a baby with him and for now let's split the bill, they can tell their grandmas honestly. What these complaints leave out is that men go on way more dates with way more women they don't actually see as long-term partners as ever before. So you can't possibly invest in everyone, and all that talk about courtship starts to sound pretty hollow. Fewer men want to invest in a woman with whom they most likely have no future. God, how much we all hate each other, as though someone is forcing people to be together. There is so much hostility everywhere, it is indeed over. These constant who owes what to whom in a relationship, this dissatisfaction with dating on both men's and women's parts leads to this vortex of preemptive accusations. Everyone feels like they are a catch. Even incels secretly believe that they deserve better. Once looks maxed, or in other words, improved their looks a bit, ex-incels want to get a 10 out of 10 woman. I don't like the idea of rating people like meat from the counter, but whatever works for others. There is this vomit-inducing genre of videos where men who recently improved their looks confess about their one-night stands with unattractive women that they now regret. But now they looksmaxed and have access to 10 out of 10 women. No amount of looksmaxing is going to fix this personality because unfortunately, wherever we go, even if we go a few points up in terms of our looks, we take ourselves and our insecurities with us. But I will give credit to the Manosphere community where credit is due. It is without a doubt that the internet, technology of mass communication, plastic surgeries, and even accessibility of editing tools changed people's perceptions of their options, romantic options forever. These days, anyone who did the bare minimum of self-improvement, be that physical or psychological or intellectual, or even simply edited their photos, is afraid to sell themselves cheaply. Behind this veneer of self-praise and entitlement, paired with endless mutual accusations, hides the fact that we have a bunch of wounded and lonely people who are all trying to have their cake and did it too. Half a year ago, there was this article by Jean Garnett on heterofatalism where the author was lamenting about her struggles with dating in New York these days, that women constantly need to decipher these cues and ambiguity from men they date, that men that she and her friends date are good, well-mannered men, not those Manosphere guys, but they still disappoint with their constant cancellation of dates due to anxiety. So the issue here is that men can't communicate clearly their wants and needs, and this burns out modern women because they have to constantly adjust their behavior, do emotional labor. The author refers to a term by Ellie Anderson called hermeneutic labor, meaning an interpretive work of a partner's emotional and psychological state, which women in heterosexual relationships do disproportionately more often than men. And essentially, women these days are stuck in this vicious cycle of ambiguity and miscommunication, while also, as Ellie Anderson points out in her article, the labor itself, these constant attempts to discuss relationships with the partner or with friends, are ridiculed and devalued. And I think that this is undoubtedly the case with heterosexual relationships and also can be extrapolated to gay relationships and friendships, family dynamics, where there is a gap in emotional involvement and a lack of communication. But I think that the key word here is relationship. A relationship that you need to maintain. What I find fascinating in the original New York Times article and also revealing about the modern day and age is that the cases that are mentioned there, like a woman having only 3 dates with a lawyer who she likes because he's awesome and good at sex, but then all of a sudden he starts answering slower and less frequently and slowly opts out. Or a guy cancelled a date because he's going through some intense anxiety, are portrayed as, quote, when did the man get so anxious about desire? And not Occam's razor that they just reject women, but do so by using therapy speak. It is a well-written article. The author has some self-aware winking jokes, is a smart, experienced woman who claims to be open to casual sex, so it seems like she would know better, and yet the elephant in the room is not addressed. These men she and her friends had few dates with or hooked up with rejected them. Demanding emotional labor or hermeneutic labor from practically strangers who are not interested in you in the first place is a bit of overreach. And it seems like women would be better at interpreting men's actions and reading between the lines since we're so good at hermeneutic labor. And yet, a German sociologist Niklas Luhmann in his Love is Passion wrote that, quote, we replace the notion of reciprocity of perspective with the much richer and much more demanding concept of interpersonal interpretation. Love is no longer a fusion of two hearts, but two different and separate units trying to negotiate their own significance in the systems of each other. But the problem is that people are also not honest with themselves and others. I'm really curious where this inability to even entertain the idea that a man can reject you comes from. Simone de Beauvoir in The Second Sex discusses how women can't play this game of being nonchalant. As de Beauvoir puts it, as much as a woman and perhaps more man revolts against anyone who attempts to exploit him sexually, but it is the woman who generally feels that her partner is using her as an instrument. Nothing but a high admiration can compensate for the humiliation of an act that she considers a defeat. I think this explains the persistent attempts to find some proof of admiration from a man who only wanted casual sex. This self-deception that he might not have communicated something properly, and I quote the article, "The men I want are not wanting me badly enough, not communicating with me clearly enough, not devoting themselves to me." This quote makes sense because it shows how without this exaltation that is only appropriate for a 19th century romantic hero of a guy being obsessed with you, there is no denying the fact that she was being sexually exploited with no benefit for her. One can say that, well, maybe she just wanted sex and got it as much as men wanted, but hey, then there would be no New York Times op-ed. If both parties were really satisfied with the outcome, she wanted more. De Beauvoir also describes this tendency of women to keep their flicker of hope that her love is reciprocated alive. Quote, "She makes trophies of the extorted replies, and if there are no replies, she takes silence to mean what she wishes. Every woman in love is more or less a paranoid. A man who is not reciprocating the same intensity of feelings is all of a sudden a narcissist and an avoidant." There are endless videos online with women calling their one-night stands or friends with benefits manipulators and narcissists, and men who have avoidant attachment style. And I'm not a clinical psychologist, so take it with a grain of salt, but some numbers are not adding up. There are so many of these cases with men diagnosed in comments under these videos as narcissists and avoidants that it seems we don't have a male loneliness epidemic, we have a man with avoidant attachment style epidemic. Of course, there are manipulative and deceitful men, narcissists with no substance or responsibility in their actions or words. But I don't think it's helpful to pathologize and give clinical diagnosis to people you only seen a few times before they disappeared into thin air. I believe in human subjectivity, and if one finds themselves in some dull, uninviting situationship, there is a way out. All of that is solved with a simple block. The lioness is not concerned with posting thirst traps on Instagram stories after no contact. There is this attempt to seem cooler or more nonchalant as you really are when we talk about dating. And this creates a vicious cycle. People see a problem in modern dating, but we never really get to the bottom of it because people tend to lie to ourselves first and foremost. But we also don't see humans in others, capable of not playing a little role in our personal theater. And nothing really makes sense if you ask me. No one knows what's happening. Nicholas Luhmann in Love as Passion writes, quote, "The points of orientation for the codification of love as a symbolic medium have shifted, and in fact so radically that one can hardly tell whether and which topics of the semantics of love can be adopted and further employed." This was relevant for the 20th century and even more so these days. No one knows how the relationships should look these days. Now people are free to choose their partners and spouses. You don't need a blessing from your parents. And even commitment is optional. So how can people still form a unity while also maintaining their self-realization and identity? Not only are we self-selecting our ego and meaning, but we also need to find meaning in the world of someone else and have that reciprocated. The selfless, unreciprocated love as a culmination of one's life that was the plot of so many novels has no place these days. Now these excesses are replaced with the lover himself or herself being the source of their love. Unrequited love is becoming a way of self-discovery or even self-promotion if you can make content out of it. Love is no longer chains that you voluntarily get into, but something that seeks various people to be realized in. When we seek companionship, be it approaching people on the streets or going on the apps, we are just looking for someone to house this stray feeling. I could run around now like a madwoman, poking every passerby with Eros the Bittersweet by Anne Carson or Plato's Symposium. talking about how Eros electrifies us by revealing absence, that it is always an interval, a gap, that imagination is the very essence of desire. But who needs that? Again, referring to Luhmann, the lover's conduct is no longer patterned on novels, but rather on psychotherapy. I guess in 2026, a lover's conduct is patterned on, I don't know, TikTok dating advices and armchair evolutionary psychology. These days, our dating gurus say that if she didn't have sex with you after a third date, it's over. Another person is needed simply because they can give you something. Looks good on photos, give sex, give money, give a family. I want it, and I want it now. Stamp my foot. And the fact that the other person is also a person and can also choose for their own well being, no, that's not allowed. But a bigger problem here is that both men's and women's lamentations on social media created ecosystems of their own. Going on endless amounts of unsuccessful dates is becoming an identity that you can successfully sell online. Cringe and trashy stories help to sustain the audience engagement, and being undesirable also becomes an identity. We seek out communities that give us identity and belonging, especially when we struggle with something as close to our hearts as romantic or even simply sexual pursuits. Anything but not to feel alienated and completely broken. But I think that there is a danger in how, in modern dating, people identify with these shallow conditions. It is a trap. Because we end up with endless mutual accusations, performances, and scripts that simply don't work. Think about the girl hinge experiment that I mentioned at the beginning, when men who are disadvantaged on these apps simply opt for the gambling logic of just repetitive strategies, hoping that they might catch someone's attention. The strategies that AI can easily replicate without anyone even noticing. We are creating love languages that no longer need humans. What the future brings is unclear. Falling into a delusion with AI chatbots, dating simulations, paying for cosplay boyfriends and girlfriends, I don't know, maybe guest marriages will become a thing, where everyone can succumb to their comfort zones without sharing the same space, without commitment or obligations, and meet each other when it is convenient. That's the way, I guess. No one is going to come to our houses with a ready-made new way of navigating one's love life in 21st century. The influencers will, but follow at your own discretion. You can follow the rules and still not get anyone, and it's no one's fault, really. No life hacks will teach you how to find both a partner for an intimate relationship and tie them to it. I was recently reading Todd McGowan's book called Embracing Alienation, where he makes a point that also somehow made me think about dating through the lens of acquiring a character. So, McGowan makes a case pro-alienation, which I find quite refreshing. We tend to consider alienation as something bad, and love is usually considered as an antidote to alienation. But McGowan focuses on the advantages of alienation. For instance, our subjectivity is born out of alienation. Separation from the others and also from ourselves gives us this critical distance that allows us to be who we are. The alienation within is what makes freedom possible. Schopenhauer also talked about how one should acquire a character instead of imitating others and rushing blindly through life. Alienation is what makes us question and reject anything that is presented to us. So maybe we will alienate to the point of figuring out something new, some more dignified and less painful ways of finding and lovingly being with each other. But for now, as long as one has a heart, one will have sorrows.